They spent the night outside the witch's hut next to a fire that had roared into life with a single tap of her foot. It stayed lit all night, even though Logain couldn't tell what was being burned inside it. Magic, he assumed, and decided it was best not to think about it too closely. There were a great many things about the hut and the objects around it that he didn't want to think about too closely. The feeling that the marionette corpses hanging in the trees were watching them, for one. The way the trees seemed to change configuration around them, for another. Indeed, in the morning, the path they'd arrived on led away in a completely different direction. Logain also didn't want to think about what sort of promise the witch had elicited from Merrick. He had gone into her hut and had remained there for hours, long enough that Logain grew concerned. He had been trying to peer in through its one filthy grit-covered window when Merrick walked out the door, alone. The man seemed shaken and quiet, and was resistant to even the most casual efforts Logain made to inquire about what had gone on. So, it was to remain a secret after all. The witch did not reappear, so the two of them slept on the leaves by the fire. Or rather, Merrick slept. Logain lay awake, watching the shadows and staring at the darkness where he knew Danon's body swung. He wondered when Danon had fled the outlaw camp, before the attack, or during. Eventually, he approached the tree and looked up at Danon's sagging, swollen face. With effort, he pulled the body down, freeing it from the branches that clutched it. He struggled at first, but suddenly the body came all at once, as if released. The moist thud as it hit the ground was followed by a sickening belch of foulness. Working with his hands, Logain collected masses of leaves and moss and small stones and buried Danon's body with them. It wasn't a proper grave. He had no idea why he did it, but he felt it was right. Sleep took him later by the fire, a fitful slumber filled with frightening wisps of images, but no dreams. When he thought he heard footsteps, he woke and saw it was morning. Then streams of sunlight came through the trees above, and the fire pit was black once again. Both of them were healed of all wounds, and piled neatly next to them were provisions, a pair of cloaks, their weapons, a bag filled with what looked like small loaves of bread and berries, and strips of dry jerky, and one shiny red apple. The hut was empty of everything but dust and rot, as if nobody had lived there for years. They searched about, but there was no sign of the witch. There was also, he noticed, no sign of Danon's body, or his makeshift grave. It seemed they were free to go. It took them 4 days' travel to leave the wilds. Supposedly, the witch had told Merrick they would see the way out once they left her hut, and sure enough, not an hour away, a bluebird appeared in the trees before them. It was so out of place and sang so sweetly that both Logain and Merrick took instant notice. As they approached, it flitted to the next tree and to the next until Logain realized it was leading them. So they followed. When it reappeared the next morning, there could be no doubt. The weather cooperated for the most part, raining only the first night, then remaining chilly and dry the nights after. Having the thick cloaks made all the difference in the world, and it wasn't long before Merrick was restored to his usual chatty self. Logain threatened to take away Merrick's cloak so the man would freeze again and perhaps be quiet for a while, but the annoying truth was that Logain found himself not minding it quite so much anymore. Pretending not to care, he listened quietly while Merrick talked about almost everything. The only thing Merrick didn't talk about was the witch. Logain was fairly certain they were passing through areas controlled by the Dalish. Several times he could have sworn that he felt eyes on him, but saw nothing in the trees. Elves were good at keeping themselves hidden when they wanted to, or these elves were. All the elves Logain had ever known were like Potter, and had lived among humans so long that the ways of the Dalish were just as foreign to them as to everyone else. There were no more unexpected encounters, though on the third night they found the remains of an overgrown ruin. It was a sight to behold, tall stone pillars jutting into the sky like rib bones, presumably having once held up a great ceiling. Part of the foundation remained, along with a set of long stairs, all of it cracked and almost reduced to rubble by the encroaching greenery. Merrick seemed awed by the structure and poked around it at length. He found the remains of an altar that held a great carving of what might once have been a dragon's head. It was faded now, though. Merrick seemed to see where the eyes and teeth might have been, and traced them out. Excitedly, he told Logan that this was probably a temple of the ancient Imperium, from back in the time when they had encroached this far south, and warred with the barbarian tribes. To him, the fact that the temple had lasted as long as it had was impressive. All Logan knew of the Imperium was that it had once been ruled by mages, and he refused to have anything more to do with magic. The idea of taking refuge in the bones of a pagan temple made him agitated, and while Merrick teased him for being superstitious, he didn't object when Logan insisted they leave. It wasn't long after leaving the ruins that they encountered wolves again. For the first time, Logan was truly beginning to believe that the old witch had called on greater magic to aid them than just summoning a bluebird guide. Logan stood with his bow at the ready, eyeing the wolves warily, while Merrick remained breathless beside him. The entire pack, however, maintained its distance and watched, but did not threaten. Logan and Merrick moved cautiously through the trees with perhaps 20 large wolves sitting and staring at them silently with their feral yellow eyes. Still, nothing happened. As soon as they were out of sight, Logan let out a long breath. He swore that he'd never wanted to encounter magic again as long as he lived, and Merrick murmured agreement. On the afternoon of the fourth day, the forest had thinned enough that Logan declared them out of the wilds. He couldn't be sure, but he believed the bluebird had led them west, just as he had originally planned, before veering north. This placed them a long way from Lothering, in the hills of the western hinterlands. Sure enough, the terrain became rockier as they traveled, and off in the distance the magnificent vista of the Frostback Mountains could be seen. Logan was pleased to see the return of the horizon. Too long spent in the wilderness with its cold and mist could drive a man mad. When the sun went down that day, the bluebird vanished. "Do you think it's going to come back?" Merrick asked. "How should I know?" "Because you're the expert on all things magical and arcane." Logan snorted. "It brought us out of the wilds. Its job is done." He looked at Merrick impatiently. "Just how hard will it be to find this army of yours? It can't be that well hidden, can it?" "We've managed to keep ahead of the usurper all these years, so I don't know." Merrick hopped onto a nearby boulder and looked out over the hills. Dusk was providing a spectacular show of orange and crimson in the sky, but darkness was coming fast. "I think they actually may be nearby. If you had asked me earlier where we had been camping, I would have said west of Lothering. So, here." "Wonderful." Logan selected a small clearing to make their camp and sent Merrick to collect wood. Now that they were away from the eternal mist, it was far easier to build a decent blaze. But he knew being out of the dense wood also meant that the fire could be seen, especially in the hills. Merrick's hunters could still be searching for him, even out here. For all Logan knew, what he'd said to Merrick about mages looking for him could be true. They might be watching for people coming out of the forest. And what then? Logan already had the beginnings of a fire going. They would take the risk until it was proved otherwise, he thought. If he tried to account for magic, he would end up chasing his tail. "I saw some more wolves," Merrick announced when he returned with wood. "And? Were they hostile?" "Well, they didn't attack, if that's what you mean, but they were planning to." "They told you that?" "Yes, in fact. They sent a rabbit with a note to inform me of their intentions." He dumped the wood unceremoniously next to the fire. "Rather gentlemanly of them, I thought." Logan ignored him and sat down on the grass, watching the darkening sky overhead. "I wonder if they were werewolves. Is there a way to tell?" "Here we go again," Logan thought to himself. He didn't look up from his task of slowly adding wood to the fire. Do I even want to know? I remember the story one of my tutors taught me about how the mist ended up in the Kokari Wilds. It has to do with werewolves. That's nice. As usual, Merrick seemed to miss Logan's uninterested tone. It was back before King Cowan had united the clan tribes. There was a curse that spread among the wolves, and they became possessed by powerful demons. They turned into monsters that preyed on the farmholds and villages in these parts, and when they were chased into the wilds, they would turn into wolves again and hide. Superstition, Logan muttered. No, it really happened. That's why everyone still keeps hounds. Back then a hound could smell a werewolf approaching and warn you, maybe even attack and give you a chance to run away. It was an epidemic. Logan paused and regarded Merrick with a weary expression. And what does that have to do with the mist? The story says that a great Jarl finally created an army of hounds and hunters and went into the wilds. For years they slaughtered every wolf they could find, possessed or no. The last werewolf swore vengeance, stabbing himself in the heart with the very blade that had slain his mate. As his blood touched the forest floor, a mist rose from that spot. The mist spread and spread until finally the Arl's army became lost in the forest. They never returned home, and eventually the Arling was abandoned. My tutor claimed that the old ruins there are haunted by the ghosts of their wives, forever waiting for their husbands. That's ridiculous, Logan sighed. There's no such thing as ghosts, and there's not nearly enough mist in the wilds to make someone lose their way. It's just a nuisance. Maybe it was different a long time ago, Merrick shrugged. Anyhow, they say that some of the werewolves survived, that they hide in these parts, taking vengeance where they can find a man alone. They say a lot of things. My tutor was a very learned man. Especially them. Logan stood up, brushing himself off and turned toward the reclining Merrick just as an arrow flew by his ear. Merrick sat up confused. Was that? Get down! Logan sank to a crouch and drew his sword. Merrick dropped to his knees, but also turned curiously to see where the arrow had come from. Unwilling to discuss the matter, Logan grabbed him by the hood of his cloak and pushed him down to his belly. Already the sound of several riders could be heard approaching the clearing, and Logan cursed himself for a fool. He had underestimated just how badly they wanted Merrick if they were on top of them already. We have to get out of here! Merrick shouted. He had drawn his own knife, but Logan was already watching two horsemen enter in the camp at full trot. The member soldiers wearing maul hauberks and full helmets, and already had their flails out and swinging. As the first horseman raced past, Logan ducked under the swing of his flail. The spiked ball passed over his head with an alarming whoosh. The second horseman was shortly behind the first, and Logan sprinted forward, jabbing it up with his sword before the soldier could begin to swing. Logan felt the point of the blade drab into the rider's armpit, and the man shouted in pain and tried to weakly bring the flail down on him. He pulled out his sword just in time to catch the flail's chain, causing the heavy ball to spin around the blade. Girding himself, he pulled hard, and the rider was flung off his mount, crying out in surprise. The soldier hit the ground awkwardly, rolling away with the flail. This time it was Logan's blade that was wrenched from him. The first rider had doubled back and was bearing down on him, leaving him with no time to do anything but watch the flail head swinging toward him. It slammed into his chest hard, several ribs cracking as the spike dug painfully into his chest. He was lifted off his feet and thrown back several paces. Logan! Merrick shouted, rushing into the melee with his dagger. He plunged the wicked blade into the leg of the mounted soldier. The man's horse reared back and whinnied as the rider screamed in pain, intentionally pulling on the reins. The other fallen soldier was groaning and trying to crawl away, and Merrick jumped over him and ran to where Logan had fallen. Logan gritted his teeth against the massive pain in his chest and tried to sit up. He was about to tell Merrick to run, but it was too late. 4 other horsemen had already arrived, one of them a knight in intricate plate armor. Clearly the leader, this one rode a great black horse and wore a full helmet with green plume. Suddenly the knight motioned for the riders behind him to stop, and they did, several of the horses rearing up and prancing on the spot. The wounded soldier with a dagger in his leg awkwardly pulled his mount back as he hissed and swore under his breath. Logan coughed painfully, but slowly got to his feet as he and Merrick stared at the riders. Why they didn't attack, he had no idea. Perhaps they intended to force them to surrender. In that case, he would send at least 1 or 2 of them to the maker. He stepped in front of Merrick and raised his sword, wincing at the spasm that sent through his cracked ribs. The first one that comes for us, he vowed, is losing an arm. That I guarantee. A couple of the riders backed up a step, glancing questioningly toward the green-plumed knight. He stared where he was, silently watching Merrick and Logan. Merrick? The knight spoke, the voice strange coming from within the helmet. Merrick gasped in astonishment. Logan's sword still raised, glanced back at him. You know each other? The knight sheathed his sword. Reaching up to his helmet, he pulled it off, and Logan realized the man's voice had sounded strange because it wasn't a man at all. Masses of thick brown curls were plastered against the woman's sweaty pale skin, yet Logan found it didn't mar her striking appearance. She had high cheekbones and a strong chin that a sculptor would have ached for, yet carried herself with a confidence that told him the armor was no affection. She was as much a soldier as the men she led, and while it was not unheard of in Ferelden for a woman to be skilled in the art of war, it was uncommon enough to be surprising. She paid no attention at all to Logan, and instead stared with shock at Merrick. He looked fairly shocked himself. "Rowan?" he asked. The brown-haired woman slid off her black horse, holding her helmet tucked under one arm and not taking her eyes off him. Passing the reins silently to one of the other horsemen, she strode forward to stand before Merrick. Logan led her, backing out of the way without dropping his blade. She said nothing, staring with her dark eyes as if she expected Merrick to respond somehow. He looked distinctly discomfited. Hello, he finally said. "It's good to see you." She remained silent, her mouth thinning into an angry frown. "Aren't you happy to see me at all?" he asked. She punched him. Her gauntleted fist slamming into Merrick's jaw sent him sprawling on his back. Lifting a curious brow, Logan watched Merrick lie there groaning and clutching his face, and then turned back to regard the female knight. She was furious now, her look daring him to go ahead and defend Merrick. He'd sheathed his sword. "Yes, you definitely know him." Hold on, guys. I'm going to see how much more this chapter has. Oh, 115 is the last page. 16 pages. Oh. Hold on. Okay, I think I'm going to stop for this part. My throat's giving out. I'll finish the chapter on the next part. So, enjoy.